The silence of deep space is oppressive, almost suffocating. It's a vast, empty void, one where time stretches out endlessly and every star feels light years away. But then, something unexpected happens. A signal comes through. It's faint at first, almost like a whisper lost in the cosmic winds. But it's enough to catch the attention of the crew aboard the UHS Nightfall, a vessel dedicated to exploring the furthest reaches of human space. Captain Wyatt, a seasoned officer with years of experience under his belt, listens carefully to the signal, his mind racing through the possibilities. There's something eerie about it. It's not the typical distress call they've received before. This one has a rhythm, an odd pattern that makes it seem intentional. And it's not from any known source. It's a faint pulse, not a beacon, not a mayday, but something far more mysterious. The decision to investigate was made quickly. They had no idea what they would find, but the call was too strange to ignore. The blackness of space swallowed them as they altered course, the ship's engines humming with anticipation as they ventured deeper into the unknown.
Dear audience, before moving forward, I would like to say, your support means the world to us. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel, press the bell icon, and share this video with your friends to keep us motivated as we bring you valuable content.
The signal was still weak, almost as if it was fading, but as they approached the coordinates, the strange pull of curiosity became irresistible. Space is vast, and in all their years of exploring, they've never encountered anything like this. It was a feeling that gnawed at them, one that reminded them just how much of space remains a mystery. Hours later, they came upon it. The black ship. It wasn't visible at first, just a small, indistinct shape floating silently in the distance, almost lost in the blackness. Then, as they drew closer, its true nature emerged from the void. The ship was massive, far larger than anything human-made. Its hull was an endless sea of darkness, absorbing the very light around it. It seemed to stretch out into infinity, its monolithic silhouette standing against the emptiness like some ancient titan. Nothing about it reflected the stars, no glimmers, no shine. It was as if the ship itself was a black hole, drawing everything into its deep, suffocating presence. The crew had seen many ships before, relics, abandoned wrecks, vessels long forgotten by time, but this was unlike anything they had ever imagined. There were no signs of life, no flickering lights, no emissions or energy signatures of any kind. The scanners were silent. It was as if the ship itself was a void, a ghost hanging in the depths of space. It should have been dead, abandoned, long forgotten, yet there it was, alive with a cold, impossible stillness. Captain Wyatt stood before the view screen, his face a mask of concentration. Something felt wrong. The ship appeared out of nowhere, its trajectory impossible to track. Ships didn't just disappear from records, did they? This wasn't some derelict drifting in from the unknown. No, this one was different. This ship didn't just vanish, it was erased. Scan for any signs of power, Wyatt ordered, his voice steady, though a knot of unease tightened in his gut. The bridge crew worked quickly, but the results were the same as before, nothing. No power signatures, no life forms, no movement. Just empty space. But that wasn't the strangest part. As the scanners worked, the ship's structure came into focus, and what they saw sent a chill down Wyatt's spine. The architecture was bizarre, alien, certainly, but not entirely unfamiliar. The lines of the ship seemed to follow human engineering principles, but twisted, distorted. It was a fusion of something entirely alien with something clearly human. Wyatt's mind raced. How could something like this exist? How could this ship have been constructed like this? It didn't make sense. "We need to board," Wyatt said, the command cutting through the heavy silence of the bridge. He felt the weight of the decision hanging in the air, but there was no other option. Something about this ship called to them, beckoning them forward despite the uncertainty, despite the danger. The crew gathered their gear, ready for whatever lay ahead. But no matter how many times they ran through the preparations, no one could shake the feeling that this was no ordinary mission. This wasn't just about exploring a derelict ship or retrieving data, it was something else. Something bigger. Wyatt couldn't explain it, but he could feel it in his bones. They were about to step into the unknown. As they approached the airlock, the ship's darkness seemed to consume them, its weight pressing down with an unsettling force. They boarded, one by one, and the strange sensation of being watched crept over them. The ship's corridors were unlike anything they had seen before, organic, almost alive, yet made of a material that didn't seem to belong in the known universe. The walls pulsed softly, as though the ship itself were breathing. The hum of the machinery, or perhaps something else entirely, vibrated through the deck plates, filling the air with a strange, low-frequency sound. And though everything was eerily still, there was a sense that the ship wasn't entirely empty. They explored the ship cautiously, each step feeling like an intrusion into something ancient and forgotten. The deeper they went, the more they began to feel like they weren't just walking through a derelict, they were trespassing in a tomb, disturbing something that should have been left untouched. No crew, no bodies, nothing to indicate who or what had once inhabited this vessel. Then, they found something unexpected. A room, sealed off and hidden away from the rest of the ship. Inside, they discovered a console, an archaic-looking terminal that seemed strangely out of place. The crew's tech expert approached it cautiously, fingers hovering over the controls. After a tense moment, he activated it. The screen flickered to life, displaying strange symbols and indecipherable data. But as they watched, the words began to change, slowly rearranging themselves into something more familiar. A message. The message was simple, yet its implications were anything but. It read, "This ship is not lost. It is waiting." Wyatt's heart raced as he read the words. The feeling of being watched intensified, and an inexplicable dread settled over him. What did it mean that the ship was waiting? For what? And why had it been erased from every record in the human database? As the crew continued to search, the sense that they were not alone grew stronger. The ship's interior, though silent, seemed to have a life of its own. As if it was aware of them, reacting to their presence. The deeper they ventured, the more unsettling it became, until they found themselves facing a corridor that seemed to stretch on forever, longer than any human-made ship should be. They couldn't shake the feeling that the walls were closing in, that the ship was somehow alive and constantly shifting, adjusting itself. With every discovery, the mystery deepened. The ship was familiar yet utterly alien. It had human elements, but they were twisted, changed by something far beyond human understanding. It wasn't just a ship. It was something else. Something older. And the more they uncovered, the more questions arose. Who had built it? Why had it been erased? And what did the ship mean by waiting? As Wyatt and the crew explored further, they began to uncover evidence of something darker, something that hinted at the horrors that may have taken place on this ship. Something that had been left behind, buried in the ship's cold metal corridors, waiting for someone to find it. But for now, the ship remained silent, its secrets locked away in the deepest recesses of its monolithic structure, as if daring them to uncover what had been hidden for so long. And Wyatt knew one thing for sure: whatever they had stumbled upon, it was no longer just an exploration. It was a warning. The black ship had been waiting for them. But for what? The deeper they moved into the ship, the more the unsettling sense of something being out of place gnawed at Wyatt. The eerie stillness in the air wasn't just an absence of sound, it was something alive, something that stretched beyond the edges of the ship and settled into the crew's very bones. The ship's corridors seemed to go on endlessly, each turn and passage leading them further into an architecture that twisted the laws of space and time, as though the ship was designed by an intelligence that didn't care for conventional physics. They passed through doorways that didn't make sense, each frame out of proportion, too high, too wide, as though they were being forced into a space that didn't belong to them. Wyatt caught himself glancing back, but the airlock door was already too far behind them. The distance was growing between what was known and what was unknown. The feeling of trespassing into something forbidden only grew stronger. The ship didn't just defy human design, it taunted it. The walls of the ship weren't made of metal, at least not in the way they knew it. It felt organic, pulsing beneath their feet, as though it were alive, breathing. The texture of the walls was smooth but strangely warm, radiating a sense of heat that seemed both unnatural and disorienting. The air smelled faintly of something metallic, but also something else. A faint, almost imperceptible odor, something like burnt ozone or decayed machinery. The sensation of being watched intensified with every step they took. They couldn't see anything, yet they felt the ship, or whatever force was controlling it, observing them, judging them. Captain Wyatt's mind raced. He had seen strange things in his career, had explored places that had been abandoned for centuries, but this ship was different. It wasn't just the design or the inexplicable size, it was the absence of everything. There was nothing in the way of civilization here. No crew. No remnants of any kind of life. The systems had been wiped clean, yet the ship itself was far too intact, far too perfect, to be a mere wreck. And those words on the console, "This ship is not lost. It is waiting." Waiting for what? Waiting for who? And why had it been erased from human records? The crew had split up into smaller teams to cover more ground, each of them marked by a palpable sense of dread. Tension had begun to crawl under their skin, as if the ship itself was pulling at the edges of their consciousness. Wyatt could feel it too. The nagging pull, that silent whispering. It was as though the very presence of the ship was warping time itself. Every moment felt stretched out, like they were living in an eternal present. Their boots echoed in the hallways, but the sound seemed muffled, as though it were coming from a place far distant. Their tech expert, the one who had first activated the console, had been working diligently to try and break the code, but every time they made progress, the ship seemed to change the parameters, scrambling their findings. Each piece of data they uncovered only led to more questions, more confusion. And then there were the visions. It was subtle at first, a flicker at the corner of their eyes, a shadow passing where there shouldn't have been one. At first, they wrote it off as fatigue or paranoia, but the longer they spent aboard, the clearer it became, they weren't alone. There were brief, almost imperceptible glimpses of movement in the distance, figures that flickered like fading light. But when they turned their heads, nothing was there. At times, Wyatt would catch a shadow moving just out of view, something dark and shapeless, like an emotion made manifest. It unsettled him. The deeper they went, the more the ship seemed to become sentient, aware of their every step. There were no sudden attacks, no violent confrontations, but a growing pressure, an invisible weight in the air that seemed to increase with every breath they took. They reached a central chamber, the heart of the ship. It was unlike any room they had encountered. The walls were covered in strange, glowing symbols, almost like hieroglyphs, but they didn't make sense. The closer they got to them, the more they felt their minds shift, as though the symbols weren't just a language, but a kind of pattern, something meant to rearrange the very fabric of their thoughts. The room seemed to hum with energy, a low frequency that vibrated through their bodies, making their bones ache with a strange resonance. Every step they took felt like it was moving them further from reality. Wyatt could feel his focus slipping. It was as if the room was trying to pull him into a deeper state of awareness, something that wanted to unravel the very core of his understanding. Then, the air began to feel heavier. There was a sudden shift, like a pressure had been building, and with it, the ship seemed to come alive. It was subtle at first, just the faintest tremor beneath their feet, the wall sighing, as if stretching. The sound of movement echoed faintly, distant at first, but growing louder. Wyatt held his breath. It was a sensation, a presence, not yet fully tangible, but undeniable. As they continued to explore the central chamber, Wyatt was struck by one detail that seemed insignificant at first. There were no human-made decals or markings on the walls. Everything about the ship was unfamiliar. Everything except for one thing, a single panel, embedded in the far wall. It wasn't much to look at, a small metallic plate, but as Wyatt approached it, his eyes locked onto something that sent a wave of cold through his chest. The plate was cracked. Not just cracked, broken. It wasn't the kind of break that came from damage or impact. No, this was different. The crack was deliberate, clean. And as Wyatt studied it, something shifted within him, a deep, unsettling realization. The ship wasn't just abandoned. It wasn't just forgotten. It was sealed. It was waiting for something to come. To break the seal. To open it. The crack was the key. With a quiet breath, Wyatt motioned for his team to gather around. He knew they had to proceed carefully, but the piece of the puzzle was finally starting to fall into place. He could feel the pressure mounting, like the ship itself was holding its breath, waiting for the crew to make the next move. But as his hand hovered over the plate, a faint whispering sound began to fill the air, soft, distant, but growing. At first, Wyatt thought it was just the hum of the ship's systems, but then it became clear it was a voice. A low, guttural murmur, like a whisper from the darkness itself. He froze. The others hadn't noticed yet, but Wyatt could hear it, could feel it echoing through the walls. It wasn't just one voice. It was a chorus, overlapping, like the sound of 1,000 voices murmuring from the very bowels of the ship. The air grew colder. There was no turning back now. Without a word, Wyatt reached out and touched the plate. The moment his fingers made contact, the hum of the ship escalated into a low, deep roar, as though the very structure of the vessel was awakening. The room trembled beneath their feet. And then, as if answering some unspoken question, the crack began to widen, slowly, almost impossibly, as if the ship itself were opening up to them. The whispering intensified, swirling around the crew in a chaotic cacophony. Wyatt's heart pounded in his chest as the crack continued to grow. Something was awakening, something deep within the ship, something that had been waiting for centuries, perhaps millennia, for them to find it. The crack was no longer just a crack, it was a gateway. And beyond that gateway, Wyatt knew, lay the answer to the greatest mystery of their lives. Whatever lay on the other side of the opening would change everything. There was no turning back now. As the crack widened further, Wyatt's breath caught in his throat. The ship was not empty. They were not alone. A shadow shifted in the corner of the room. Something was coming. The air in the central chamber grew colder, and the whispering voices became louder, more distinct, as if they were trying to communicate directly with the crew. Captain Wyatt could feel his pulse racing, each beat of his heart vibrating through his body. The crack in the metallic plate had widened just enough now, revealing an eerie, black void beyond it. Whatever lay on the other side seemed to pulse with a strange energy, like it was alive, breathing. Wyatt's team stood frozen, eyes wide with the same mix of dread and curiosity. Every instinct in him screamed to pull back, to retreat from the unknown, but his feet felt rooted to the ground, unwilling to move away from the opening. The whispering voices that filled the room seemed to push him forward, as if the ship itself was guiding him toward whatever lay hidden inside. Suddenly, there was a soft, creaking sound like metal scraping against metal. Wyatt's attention snapped to the opening as a shadow moved within it. His breath caught in his throat. The shadow wasn't a simple movement of darkness, like he'd expected, it had substance. It was more than just the absence of light, it was something real, something alive. His mind reeled, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. But the more he stared into the abyss, the clearer it became, something was about to emerge. The others didn't seem to notice yet. Their eyes were still fixed on the widening crack, oblivious to the growing tension in the air. But Wyatt could feel it, a presence, like the very walls of the ship were closing in on them. The temperature in the room dropped even further, and now there was an unmistakable hum, deep and vibrating, resonating through the floor and walls. His crew shifted uneasily, glancing around, but none of them had the courage to speak. It was as if they all instinctively knew something was coming, but none of them wanted to acknowledge it. Then, a low thud broke the silence. The shadow had moved again, this time far more distinctly. Something large was emerging from the dark void, something that shouldn't have been there. Wyatt's hands tightened around his weapon, but the impulse to fire was pushed down by a sense of caution. He knew they couldn't afford to make a move without understanding what they were dealing with. The crew shifted uneasily, all of them now staring at the crack, unable to tear their eyes away from it. The ship itself seemed to groan, its very structure resonating with an ancient power. The shadow beyond the crack took on more defined shapes now, shifting, undulating. Wyatt squinted, trying to make sense of it. It was almost as if the dark figure was made up of shifting fragments, pieces of something that didn't belong, something that didn't obey the rules of physics or biology. The longer he stared at it, the more his mind seemed to unravel, as though it were trying to force him to see something beyond his comprehension. The others began to murmur, their voices shaky, torn between fear and curiosity. One of the crew members, the tech expert who had been working on the console earlier, took a step forward, drawn by the mystery of what lay inside the crack. His hand reached out slowly, almost instinctively, as though he were hypnotized by the pulsing energy coming from within the opening. "No, don't," Wyatt muttered under his breath, but the words seemed to get lost in the oppressive silence. The crew member didn't hear him, or perhaps didn't care. His fingers brushed against the edge of the crack, and in that instant, the air seemed to vibrate with a strange, almost tangible force. A pulse of energy shot through the room, and the shadow within the void jerked violently. Suddenly, the ground beneath their feet shook. The entire ship groaned as if waking from a long, deep slumber. Wyatt's heart pounded as the ship began to move, not like a living creature, but like an ancient beast stretching its limbs after millennia of stillness. The walls of the room buckled, and the crack widened even more, releasing a sickly green light that flooded the chamber. The crew staggered back, barely able to keep their footing as the air became thick with a static charge. Wyatt's mind raced. This was not what they had expected. The whispering voices now turned into something else, an unintelligible cacophony, rising in volume until it felt like 1,000 voices were crashing into their minds all at once. It was overwhelming, a sound that scraped against their sanity, making it harder to think, harder to breathe. Wyatt staggered back, clutching his head, the voices pushing at the edges of his mind, trying to pry open his thoughts, to control him. One of the crew members dropped to their knees, covering their ears as if trying to block out the noise, but it was useless. There was no escape. They were inside the ship, and the ship had them. There was no turning back now. "Get to the control room," Wyatt shouted, his voice barely rising above the chaos. But his words felt hollow, as if they were being swallowed by the noise. The crew looked at him, fear etched on their faces, but they didn't move. No one moved. Everyone was rooted to the spot, frozen in place by the overwhelming pressure of whatever force was at work inside the ship. The shadow inside the void moved again, a massive form shifting within the darkness, more substantial now, less abstract. Wyatt's breath hitched as he caught a glimpse of something he would never forget: a set of glowing eyes. The eyes weren't human. They weren't even alien, not in any sense he understood. They were something else, an intelligence, ancient and vast, that reached out and touched his mind. His heart raced, and he instinctively stepped back, but the shadow followed. It reached out from the crack, pulling itself through with a slow, deliberate motion. The air felt heavy with dread, as though every molecule of oxygen was being siphoned away. The temperature continued to plummet, the cold now biting into their skin, chilling them to the core. As the shadow continued to emerge, Wyatt could make out more details: long, spindly limbs, dark tendrils that seemed to stretch and contract with a life of their own. But it was the face that caught his attention, if it could even be called a face. It was like looking into the void itself, a swirling mass of dark, impenetrable features, with glowing eyes that seemed to burn with an unnatural light. The face, or what passed for a face, stared directly at Wyatt, its eyes narrowing, as if acknowledging him, as if it knew he was the one who had come to open the door, the one who had come to wake it. A low, guttural sound rumbled from the depths of the ship. It wasn't a voice, not in the sense they understood. It was a thought, a wave of emotion that washed over them, something that crawled into their minds like an infection. The crew members gripped their heads, some of them stumbling, others falling to their knees, overwhelmed by the strange presence that now enveloped them. Wyatt tried to force his mind to focus. He had to think. He had to make a decision. There was no room for fear, no room for hesitation. But how could they fight something like this? Something that wasn't even of their world, that was more than just a being, it was a force, an entity beyond their comprehension. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to escape the ship and leave this nightmare behind. But he couldn't. He had to know what it wanted. He had to understand what was happening. The eyes of the entity glowed brighter, as though reading his thoughts, and a cold laugh echoed through the chamber. It wasn't a sound they could hear, not with their ears, but a sensation they could feel in the very marrow of their bones. It was mocking them, toying with them, and with that, a sudden clarity washed over Wyatt. This wasn't just a ship. It wasn't just a place. The ship was alive, and it had been waiting for them. Waiting for him. Suddenly, the shadow lunged forward, its tendrils reaching out, but before it could make contact, everything went black. The darkness was absolute, a suffocating void that pressed in from all sides. Captain Wyatt's senses were overwhelmed. His body felt weightless, as though he was suspended in time and space, floating in an endless abyss. His heartbeat thundered in his ears, a rhythm that seemed to echo through the void, and yet, he couldn't be sure if he was still even alive. The blackness had consumed everything. It was all he could feel, all he could perceive. He tried to move, to force his limbs into action, but there was no space, no ground beneath his feet to push against. For what felt like hours, there was nothing but that cold, oppressive silence, broken only by the hum of distant engines, like the heartbeat of the ship. Wyatt's mind raced. Where was his crew? Were they still with him? Had they been consumed by the darkness, lost to whatever malevolent force lurked within the ship's walls? He tried to call out, but his voice seemed to vanish as soon as it left his throat, swallowed by the abyss. Then, just as suddenly as it had descended, the blackness began to fade. A faint glimmer of light appeared on the horizon, like the first star after a long, dark night. Slowly, painfully, Wyatt's senses returned to him. The weightlessness receded, and he felt the hard, cold floor beneath his feet once again. His eyes snapped open. The room was different now, a stark contrast to the one he had left behind. The walls, once smooth and metallic, were now covered in strange symbols, glowing faintly with an eerie, otherworldly light. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of something ancient, like dust and decay. Wyatt's breath caught in his throat. There was no sound, no movement, only the oppressive stillness of the place. But he knew something had changed. Something had shifted. He pushed himself up, his muscles protesting as he rose to his feet. His mind was still foggy, disoriented, but one thing was clear: he had to find his crew. The rest of the team had to be here somewhere. They had to be alive. He couldn't know, he wouldn't be the only one left. The whispers still lingered at the edges of his consciousness, a faint echo of the voices he had heard before, and with them came the unmistakable feeling that he was being watched. His pulse quickened, and he moved forward, his steps slow and deliberate. Every corner of the ship seemed to be alive, pulsing with a malevolent energy, the walls themselves pressing in on him as though the ship were trying to consume him. He had to keep moving. There was no time to lose. The ghostly whispers grew louder, as if the ship was calling to him, guiding him deeper into its maze-like structure. Wyatt clenched his fists, forcing the fear to the back of his mind. Fear would do nothing now. He had to think clearly, had to understand what was happening. As he turned the corner, a sharp noise echoed through the silence, a clatter of metal, the sound of something falling. Wyatt froze, his heart leaping into his throat. His instinct screamed at him to hide, to retreat, but there was nowhere to go. The ship was closing in around him, and if he didn't act now, he would be swallowed by it. He moved forward cautiously, peering around the corner. The sight that met his eyes nearly made his stomach drop. There, in the center of the hallway, lay one of his crew members. Their body was sprawled on the floor, their form contorted in a way that defied natural movement. But what was even more horrifying was the marking strange, glowing symbols etched into their skin, pulsating with a sickly green light. Wyatt's stomach twisted, his breath coming in shallow gasps as he took a step back. What had happened to them? How had this happened? But before he could process the sight further, a sharp, guttural sound cut through the silence. Wyatt whirled around, his pulse racing, and there, standing at the far end of the hall, was another figure. It wasn't human, not anymore. It had once been a member of his crew, but now it was something else entirely. The features were distorted, almost alien, with dark veins pulsating beneath the skin. Those eyes were empty, devoid of any life, replaced by an eerie, glowing red that seemed to pierce through the shadows. Wyatt's breath caught in his chest as he realized the horrifying truth. The entity, whatever it was that had been awakened by their presence, had infected them. The crew members who had touched the ship, who had ventured too far into its depths, had been consumed, transformed into things that no longer resembled the people they once were. The figure twitched, its head jerking unnaturally, as if it were struggling to regain control. It staggered toward Wyatt, dragging its body with an eerie, uneven gait. The once human shape now seemed nothing more than a puppet, its movements jerky and unpredictable, like a creature that had been warped by something ancient, something powerful. Wyatt's breath quickened, his mind racing for an escape, but there was nowhere to run. This thing was not going to stop. Not until it had him. "Captain!" A voice rasped, but it wasn't the crew member's voice. It was something else. Something that shouldn't have spoken. Wyatt's heart skipped a beat. He backed away slowly, keeping his eyes fixed on the creature. The hall stretched endlessly in both directions, and Wyatt's mind screamed for him to make a decision. But what choice did he have? He could either face this thing or face the unknown depths of the ship, which might hold far worse horrors. The creature staggered closer, its eyes glowing brighter, a sickening sound rising in its throat. It seemed to be feeding on Wyatt's fear, drawing strength from his growing terror. And with every passing second, the ship's malevolent presence seemed to grow stronger, more insistent. The walls of the corridor shuddered, as if the ship itself were reacting to the entity's presence. Something ancient, something powerful, was alive in this ship, and Wyatt knew it had been waiting for him. For them. In the distance, he could hear more movements, more creatures, more twisted shadows that had once been human. The realization hit Wyatt like a punch to the gut: they weren't alone. The ship was not just a vessel, it was a trap. A trap set for anyone who dared to enter, a trap designed to consume all who trespassed within its walls. The ground shook again, this time with a force that made Wyatt's teeth rattle. The ship was alive. It was awakening. But just as the creature lunged toward him, the ship let out a violent, deafening roar, as if the very walls of the vessel had torn themselves apart. The lights flickered wildly, and for a split second, everything went silent. The world tilted. Wyatt's stomach lurched as the gravity in the corridor shifted unexpectedly. His feet slid out from under him, and he crashed to the ground, the air knocked from his lungs. The shadows in the hallway seemed to close in around him, and the whispers, the voices that had been ever present, grew louder, more insistent, almost demanding. He pushed himself up, gasping for air, but something was different. The ship had changed. Its grip on him had tightened, and the ship itself felt alive, more so than before. It wasn't just an artifact of alien design, it was sentient, and it was bent on destroying them. A sharp metallic screech echoed through the hallway. Wyatt turned, his heart pounding in his chest, but what he saw next made his blood run cold. The walls were shifting, contorting, changing shape, and at the center of it all, that same glowing presence from before, the thing that had emerged from the darkness, was pulling itself forward. Wyatt had no choice but to run. But as he turned to flee, something grabbed him, a cold, iron grip that tightened around his wrist. He gasped in shock, trying to tear free, but the force was too strong. The walls, the ship itself, were holding him in place. His breath quickened. There was no escape. There was only one path forward. And it was into the heart of the darkness. Wyatt's heart thundered in his chest as the grip on his wrist tightened. He twisted and pulled, his nails scraping against the cold, smooth surface of the ship's walls. But the more he struggled, the tighter the grip became, as though the ship itself was holding him there, trapping him in its iron-like embrace. His breath came in shallow gasps, his mind racing, his senses overwhelmed by the pulsating pressure of the vessel. Something was wrong. It wasn't just the ship, it was him. He could feel it now, deep in his bones, a gnawing presence in the pit of his stomach. Something was shifting within him. He glanced at his wrist, the place where the cold, invisible grip had latched onto him, and saw the faint glow of the strange markings that had begun to appear across his skin. It wasn't just the walls that were alive, it was as if he was being marked too, like some dark force was branding him, taking root inside his very soul. "Captain!" The voice came again, rasping from somewhere just beyond his reach, distant yet familiar. His instinct screamed at him to turn and face whatever horror was behind him, but his legs refused to obey. He had to get away. He had to move. But it was already too late. With a violent, sickening snap, the grip on his wrist broke free, and Wyatt was sent hurtling backward into the darkness. He barely had time to brace himself before his back slammed into the cold floor. Pain exploded through him, but before he could react, the walls around him seemed to pulse, vibrating with a strange, rhythmic thrum. The ship had shifted again, reconfiguring itself as though it were alive, reacting to his every move. The lights flickered, casting long, jagged shadows that danced along the walls, and then it hit him, an overwhelming surge of emotion, of pure desperation, flooded his mind. He gasped, his eyes wide with horror as the whispers turned into screams, and the voices of his crew flooded his consciousness. It was as though they were calling to him, begging him to understand. But their words were incoherent, broken by the sound of a voice he did not recognize. "You should have never come here." The voice was deep, guttural, and ancient, and it reverberated through every fiber of his being. His pulse spiked as he realized the truth. The ship wasn't just an alien artifact, it was a prison, and they had unwittingly become part of its curse. Wyatt's breath caught in his throat. A cold sweat broke out across his forehead. The air seemed to thicken around him, and with each passing second, the ship's presence grew more oppressive. It wasn't just the walls that were closing in, it was the ship's will, something malevolent that had been waiting, lurking, for the right moment to awaken. The walls shifted again, opening up into a larger, darkened chamber. As he stumbled forward, Wyatt noticed something at the center of the room, a dark, swirling mass that pulsed with a sickly green glow. It was like a living vortex, a hole in reality itself, stretching out into an endless void. And at its center, something was moving. For a moment, Wyatt couldn't comprehend what he was seeing. His mind refused to believe it. The swirling mass in front of him seemed to warp the air itself, distorting the space around it like a mirage. But then the shapes within it became clearer figures, twisted and broken, their bodies writhing within the vortex, struggling to escape. He knew, deep down, what it was. They were the lost souls of the ship, the ones who had entered before them, and now they were trapped, eternally bound to the ship's malevolent force. The realization hit him like a bolt of lightning. The ship was feeding on them. It wasn't just trapping them, it was transforming them into something else. Something worse. Wyatt's breath caught in his throat as one of the figures turned its head toward him. Its eyes black, hollow, endless pits locked onto his with an unholy, unnatural intensity. He froze, unable to tear his gaze away as the figure's face twisted into a grotesque smile. And then, in a voice that was not its own, it whispered, "You will become one of us. You will join us in the darkness." The word sent a chill through Wyatt's very core. Panic surged through his veins, and he staggered backward, stumbling over his own feet. His mind was in overdrive, thoughts racing 1,000,000 miles an hour. He had to escape. He had to do something. Suddenly, a loud, bone-rattling screech echoed through the chamber, and the air around him seemed to compress. A cold, suffocating pressure slammed down on his chest, pushing the air from his lungs. He gasped for breath, struggling against the invisible weight that threatened to crush him. The ship was alive. And it was trying to break him. The walls seemed to twist in unnatural directions, forming impossible shapes. As the room began to spin, Wyatt saw them again, the twisted, contorted shapes of the ship's previous victims, their eyes glowing in the darkness, their forms indistinguishable from the ship's very being. They were no longer human, they were something else entirely, slaves to the ship's will. And soon, if he didn't act, he would be too. He struggled to his feet, his breath shallow, and his head spinning. The whispers grew louder, more desperate. They were closing in on him, pulling at his mind, tearing at the very fabric of his thoughts. He had to break free. He had to escape before the ship did to him what it had done to the others. But then, a new voice, one that was calm, distant, cut through the chaos. "Captain!" Wyatt turned sharply. Standing in the doorway, bathed in a faint blue light, was one of his crew members. It was impossible. The person was supposed to be dead, consumed by the ship's darkness. And yet, here they were, alive, or at least not entirely dead. The figure stepped forward, their eyes vacant, their movement slow and deliberate. "You should not have come, Captain. You will never leave this place." Wyatt's heart pounded in his chest, his mind racing. There was no time left. The ship was breaking him down, piece by piece. Every breath was a struggle. Every thought was a battle. The room seemed to darken further, the walls closing in. The figure's face twisted, the smile growing wider. It was as if the very ship was feeding off his fear, drawing power from it, intensifying its grip on him. The dark, swirling mass in the center of the room began to pulse in rhythm with his heartbeat, as if the ship itself were synchronizing with him. There was no escape. Not anymore. The realization hit Wyatt like a punch to the gut. He wasn't just fighting for his life. He was fighting to hold on to his humanity. And soon, he feared, even that would be lost to the darkness. Wyatt's heart slammed in his chest, his mind racing in a whirlwind of confusion and fear. The crew member, no, it wasn't really them, stepped closer, its vacant eyes piercing into him. The smile that twisted across the figure's face was nothing human. It was wide, grotesque, and filled with an unnatural hunger. The ship seemed to respond, its walls groaning as though it were alive, feeding off the fear that radiated from Wyatt. The whispers were louder now, overwhelming him, clawing at his mind. He could feel the ship pulling at him, trying to strip away everything that made him human. His instinct screamed at him to run, to break free, but the cold weight of the ship's presence held him in place. The air around him felt thick, oppressive, as if the very space had become a prison. There was no escaping this. The ship had already won. But then, something inside Wyatt snapped. He wasn't just going to give in. He wasn't going to let the ship have him. Not without a fight. In that moment, something inside him shifted. A quiet resolve settled over him, a flicker of clarity amidst the chaos. He understood now. The ship wasn't just a trap, it was an experiment, a test. It was trying to break him, to turn him into something else, just like it had done with the others. But Wyatt was different. He had something the ship didn't anticipate. Free will. He stepped forward, his legs shaky but determined, his fists clenched. The twisted figure before him hissed, its smile widening as if it sensed his resolve. It reached for him, its hands elongating like claws, but Wyatt wasn't afraid. The ship may have had power over the others, but it wouldn't have him. Not like this. With a primal roar, Wyatt surged forward, slamming into the figure. The ship shook, the walls vibrating violently as if protesting his actions. But he didn't stop. He grabbed the creature by its throat and twisted, the muscles in his arms straining against the force. As the creature's grotesque form began to collapse into itself, the walls of the ship shuddered, and the whispers turned into agonized screams. It was as if the ship was reacting to its own creation being torn apart. The air shifted again, heavier this time, as if something was stirring deep within the vessel. Wyatt pulled his hand back, panting, his eyes wide with a mix of terror and adrenaline. The ship was alive, but it wasn't just the walls or the architecture. It was the very soul of the ship that had been influencing him, trying to break his will. He glanced around the room, the dark mass still pulsating, but now weaker. He could feel it. Something was changing. The oppressive weight that had been suffocating him began to lift. But it wasn't over yet. Before he could take another step, the room exploded into chaos. The walls cracked open, revealing twisted figures, those lost souls rising from the ground. They clawed their way toward him, their hollow eyes glowing with that same unnatural light. But this time, something was different. They weren't just moving mechanically, they were in pain, trapped, as if the very essence of their existence had been shattered. The ship's power had broken, and now the souls were suffering because of it. Wyatt knew what he had to do. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for them. For everyone who had fallen victim to this cursed ship. The glowing mass in the center of the room pulsed again, this time sending a shockwave of energy through the chamber. Wyatt's ears rang, and his body jerked as if being pulled toward the center. He struggled, his muscles screaming in protest, but he couldn't fight it. Then, something unexpected happened. As the mass drew him closer, the light inside it shifted, revealing something hidden deep within. There, in the heart of the ship, was a figure, a being, its shape shifting in and out of focus, its form humanoid but inhuman at the same time. It wasn't a soul. It wasn't a ship. It was the entity behind it all. The one that had been orchestrating everything from the start. It spoke in a voice that resonated inside his head, deeper than any voice had a right to be. You shouldn't have resisted. You are mine now. But Wyatt wasn't afraid anymore. He had seen the truth, understood what the ship was. The entity was a parasite, feeding off the fear, the suffering, and the submission of those it trapped. But he wasn't like them. And he wasn't about to let this entity consume him, too. With a final surge of energy, Wyatt broke free from the pull of the mass. The walls of the ship screamed, the ship itself trembling as if it were in pain. The entity's voice grew more desperate, more insistent, but Wyatt stood firm. He reached out and touched the surface of the mass, the dark energy thrumming under his fingertips. For a moment, everything went silent. The weight in the room lifted. Then, with a deafening crack, the mass shattered. The walls of the ship groaned in agony as they began to collapse in on themselves. Wyatt stumbled backward, the sudden release of pressure nearly knocking him off his feet. The entity's voice, once so confident, now faltered. Its form twisted, warping in agony as the ship's energy began to dissipate. The souls that had once been trapped inside the vessel screamed in a chorus of relief, their forms fading into the darkness as they were freed from their prison. But as the ship began to implode, Wyatt realized there was one final twist. The ship, in its dying moments, had activated something far worse than it had ever been before. A final message flickered across the walls, scrawled in a language he could barely comprehend. And then, just as the ship's energy was about to extinguish completely, a single word echoed through the chambers. Return. And that was when Wyatt understood. The ship had not just been a vessel, it had been a beacon. A call to something much darker, far older, that was now on its way. The ship had failed, but it had set something else in motion. The worst was yet to come. The deafening roar of the collapsing ship reverberated through the air as Wyatt stumbled to regain his balance. The walls were cracking, the floor buckling under the pressure of something beyond human comprehension. He was almost certain the ship wasn't just imploding, it was being torn apart from the inside out. Every inch of it seemed to scream in agony as the black mass he had shattered began to break down. But amidst the chaos, a sense of urgency gnawed at Wyatt. The message had been clear, and the ship's collapse was only part of the equation. The word return still echoed in his mind like a drumbeat, impossible to ignore. Whatever had been summoned, whatever had been called, was already on its way. And the ship's destruction might have only been a small part of something far larger. He scanned the wreckage, eyes darting from one collapsing segment of the ship to another. The crew. He needed to find them. There was no way they could all be gone. They had to be somewhere, still alive, still fighting the same battle he was. But as he moved through the wreckage, his heart sank. There were no signs of life, no flickers of energy in the surrounding rooms. They were gone. Just like the others. Just like all the souls trapped in this nightmare. A deep, hollow feeling began to fill his chest, the weight of it pressing against his ribs. Had he failed them all? Had his battle, his resistance, been for nothing? The ship was collapsing, but the message, the call, it hadn't stopped. Wyatt shook his head, pushing the thoughts aside. There was no time to dwell on defeat. If this thing was coming, if whatever was behind all of this was returning, then he needed to be ready. As the ship shuddered around him, Wyatt moved with purpose. He reached the bridge, where the remains of the control systems flickered weakly, and the view of the black void outside gave him an eerie sense of perspective. He had been a part of this thing, this ship, and now he was a witness to its end. But something about the message still gnawed at him. Return. It felt like a warning, like a final step in something that had been in motion long before Wyatt had ever set foot on this cursed vessel. He activated the bridge's last functional terminal and tried to piece together what he could from the scattered data. There it was again, a reference to something old, something beyond human history. The ship's purpose had been to summon. To call. And the entities behind it were not simply alien. They were ancient, primordial forces, older than humanity itself. Their call had been buried in the depths of space, lost to time, but now it had been answered. And if Wyatt's instincts were correct, the arrival of these beings wasn't just the end for him, but for everyone, everything. He turned from the terminal, staring out into the abyss of space. It was silent. Too silent. The ship's energy systems were failing, but the starless expanse beyond was still waiting. And then he saw it. A faint glimmer, a flicker of something far off in the distance. His breath caught in his throat. It wasn't just a glimmer. It was something coming closer. Something large. Something alive. The return was happening. Wyatt's mind raced. The ship had failed, yes. It had collapsed under the weight of its own power, the twisted influence of the entity that had been manipulating it. But it wasn't the end. Not yet. The beings behind the ship's existence had been waiting for this moment, for the final signal to be sent. He grabbed the comms system, hoping to reach out, hoping to connect with someone, anyone. But the static was overwhelming. No one was out there. The crew was gone, and it was just him now, just Wyatt, alone in the wreckage of a ship that had borne the weight of an ancient darkness. There was no choice. No other option. He had to fight. He had to stop it, whatever it was that was coming. Wyatt turned back to the terminal, focusing all of his energy on the remaining systems. His mind whirled as he tried to formulate a plan, a strategy. But the truth was, he didn't know what he was up against. How could he? These were forces older than humanity itself. Forces that had been hidden away, sealed from the universe for eons. And now, with the ship's destruction, they were free. A low hum filled the room, faint but growing stronger. Wyatt's pulse quickened. He could feel it now, the weight of something pulling at him, tugging at the very fabric of space around him. It was here. The return was complete. Suddenly, the ship lurched violently, throwing him against the console. Wyatt gritted his teeth, fighting to keep his footing. He knew that whatever was coming, whatever had been summoned, was not going to just let him go. It wanted him, too. It had been watching him from the beginning, toying with him, testing him. Now it was time for the final reckoning. The lights flickered as the ship began to tear itself apart around him. Pieces of the structure, twisted and jagged, fell away, exposing the vast emptiness of space. Wyatt could hear the screams in his mind again, the tortured souls of those who had fallen victim to the ship's power, to its curse. They were crying out for release, for freedom. And now, so was he. He ran, moving as fast as he could through the crumbling corridors of the ship. He wasn't sure where he was going anymore, but he knew he couldn't stay here. He couldn't let the entity take him, not like it had taken the others. The thought of it of becoming just another lost soul, another pawn in the hands of something ancient, spurred him on. Then, as if in response to his thoughts, the ship trembled once more. The air shifted. Wyatt turned a corner, his heart racing, and came face to face with a figure. But it wasn't a crew member. It wasn't even human. The being before him was vast, taller than anything he had ever seen, its form twisting in ways that defied comprehension. It shimmered in and out of focus, its presence overwhelming, suffocating. It was them. The beings that had been called. The return was complete. And it had come for him. You resist. The voice echoed in his mind, not a sound but a presence, deep and terrible. Why? Wyatt didn't answer. There were no words for what he was feeling. Fear, yes. Desperation, yes. But there was something else, something more. Something that pushed him forward, even as the darkness closed in around him. I will not bow to you, Wyatt said, his voice shaking but firm. Not like the others. The entity laughed, a sound like 1,000 voices scraping against the edges of his mind. You cannot resist what you do not understand. And with that, the darkness engulfed him. But Wyatt didn't surrender. He fought with every ounce of his strength, not with weapons, but with his will. The entity was ancient, powerful, but it was not invincible. It had failed before. And it would fail again. The final moments were a blur, shifting shapes, dissonant whispers, flashes of light and shadow. But amidst it all, one thought remained in Wyatt's mind. The fight was far from over. As the light flickered and the ship continued its collapse, Wyatt understood something that no one before him had. The fight against the darkness was eternal. But humanity? Humanity had a power that even the oldest forces of the universe couldn't comprehend. He wasn't just a survivor. He was a resistance. And as the final pieces of the ship disintegrated into nothing, the echoes of the entity's voice faded into the void, leaving behind only the silence of space and the resolute, unyielding presence of a human spirit.